All right. Well, I have here Dr. Rick Perkins from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette. He teaches history and systems of psychology to the master's students over there, and I actually was in that class and learned from him in that class. Uh, so I asked you to talk today about psychoanalysis because I have some concerns about psychoanalysis and wanted to kind of get your take on that. But you might want to hedge this by saying maybe you're not a spokesperson for psychoanalysis.
Right, right. And what I expressed to you before you started the recording was that my particular take on psychoanalysis is that I am not going to fight for the death for every single concept as being correct. My educational lineage bounced around a little bit. My first advisor in my PhD program was clinically psychoanalytic and taught from a very psychoanalytic perspective. Although what I didn't realize at the time is that it was not pure classic Freudian psychoanalytic perspective, but more of a modern or late 20th century narrative-based psychoanalytic approach that placed a lot more of an emphasis on clinical experience and less on what we would call meta-theoretical aspects of psychoanalytic theory. Then I ended up moving to an advisor who is a behavior analyst influenced by radical behavioral philosophy, including people like Skinner. And that ended up leading to me more and more sort of framing the aspects of psychoanalytic theory that appeal to me almost from a quasi behavior analytic perspective, which is not to me as illogical as it might strike you initially, in my opinion.
So you're allowed to be eclectic and diverse theoretically.
Apparently, which the challenge that I would give to anybody who's thinking about this or watching this video is that eclectic does not mean put a bunch of concepts into a basket, dump them out, and say, that's what I believe in. That eclectic requires a little bit of a challenge of how can I make this coherent? How can I make these different elements from these different perspectives create a narrative that is defensively coherent, around that?
Yeah,
So,
you're not sitting on the fence. You've created something that makes a lot of sense and you'd stand by.
yeah, and I'd stand by it as being workable. And again, my particular, what I have discovered over the years, and even the class that you took with me sort of helped me to sort of more fully discover this, is that and sort of an underlying implied value that I have is influenced by pragmatism, which is the underlying perspective of if it works, it is in some sense at least true. And that helps a lot because that takes a little bit of a pressure of me saying, well, this concept is absolutely the way that humans are built. And it's more of, well, what does this give us? What does this not give us? How does this influence our behaviors that we engage in around this? And when we're talking about weaknesses, it's also going to be what unintended effects or what sort of problematic effects would using this terminology have. I am curious about some of your misgivings about psychoanalysis. I might even agree with some.
Well, I should hope so. In my attempts at, I don't want a straw man psychoanalysis. I want an Iron Man psychoanalysis. I want to beat the Iron Man, not the straw man of psychoanalysis. And in my attempts at discovering the Iron Man version of psychoanalysis, I find that they preface it a lot with kind of how you prefaced it by saying, we've moved away from Freud. In some respects, the core concepts are there, but we've jettisoned a lot of the kind of surface level, non-essential stuff that frankly gives Freud and psychoanalysis a bad name. I was wondering if you could elaborate that on a little bit, because I also have not heard of narrative-based. I had not heard that phrase, but I was familiar with it because I know there's some really well-respected research about um, like just narrative-based theories. I didn't know that was connected in any way to psychoanalytic approaches.
It is not exclusively related to
Okay.
psychoanalytic processes. Narrative psychology and research on narrative psychology has a broad range of theoretical inputs into them, but elements of thinking about things in terms of narratives ended up entering into through the zeitgeist, I believe, entering into discussions in the late 20th century about what is really happening in psychoanalytic therapy and what are the implications of that for how we would engage people in, in a psychotherapeutic setting. To some degree, there was a movement over time into, for example, what is an interpretation? A big concept in psychoanalytic psychotherapy is the concept of the interpretation, where the analyst listens or the therapist listens to somebody talk about their childhood. And then at a certain point, you interject some sort of framed, tentative explanation for why this might be happening, why a person might be behaving or thinking in this way based upon their conversation. If you go back to the early 20th century and Freud, and not just Freud, but a lot of the early people who wrote in psychoanalysis, the tone of a lot of what they wrote was almost the tone that you would take if you were an archaeologist on a dig. That the idea that the artifacts or the gold that you're looking for is knowable, it's down there, down there under the ground, and then we're going to engage in this tried and true method of digging into your real past, and we are going to discover the real origin of your, distress, or of your issues, or however you want to phrase it. And I think that people like myself don't buy into that. That in the sense that it's, for one thing, it's, even if there is some real reason why you are the way you are, we live in the here and now. We don't live in your childhood. So there's no way that we can, with any degree of certainty or even confidence, know for sure that what we talk about in a session is finding that real cause, right? So, and then there was a modification of that as they headed into like the middle 20th century. There was a clinical modification of that where it was more like, yeah, the stuff that's going on, it's important that we try to find the real cause, even though we know that it's impossible to fully do because of the nature of verbal interactions. As it started to head a little bit more into sort of modern narrative kind of approaches, that there were people within the field of psychoanalysis, including apparently people who influenced my advisor, although he didn't really, lay this out immediately when he supervised me, is that, well, really what you have is a client and a therapist engaged in conversations or discussions or examination of a bunch of important topics, and that usually the client brings in a particular narrative of what's happened, and also like it's embedded in a narrative of how the world works, and that the therapist or analyst brings into the session their own narrative about how to talk about the world and how they see how things work in the world. And they have a conversation where these two narrative styles have an encounter over a long period of time, where you end up sort of seeing, okay, well, what's the story? How is this story having an impact over the things that you do? And And is this the only way that we can tell the story of your life? You know, and then you kind of modify it. And what ends up happening in sort of like the treatment of truth in this particular approach is that to some degree, if a person from this standpoint tells me some important, intense memory of an interaction with their father, you know, when they were young, it's not of critical importance to me that I know for sure, that I'm confident that it happened the way that this person said. And it would be sort of folly for me to make that a priority anyway. But not only do I acknowledge I can't know, I'm actually taking a position that that's not important. What's important is how these stories or how this narrative is alive in your here and now of your life. So then your past has a less of a linear deterministic connection to its implications for the present. And it has more of this sort of linguistically mediated, you know, kind of importance in your current narrative and how it plays out in the therapeutic relationship, i.e. transference and related concepts, and how it might be playing out in your description of things going on in your life right now, which we would think of as kind of dynamic kinds of interpretation.
I'm glad you went into that because I can see a very promising path going forward of being more appreciative of Freud, and because this is palatable to me. I can get behind this.
And keep in mind that when you read the original Freud, you don't get that tone that I just struck, right? Because Freud came from an era that where he was very influenced by perspectives that as a philosophy major, they were very influenced by what we would call correspondence theories of truth, right? You know, this like underlying assumption that there is a truth that is out there that we can work towards knowing, and the value of my perspective or the value of what I talk about is how well does it map onto that truth. And I think that what that led to is that Freud never completely left that kind of mindset. So, he ended up sort of boxing himself in my opinion, at certain points, and being like really attached to, well, if this is true and I assert that it must be, then this must be the case, in which case I need to come up with some concept to explain how X, Y, or Z happens.
Yeah, I definitely get the impression that Freud wanted to be seen as a scientist, not as a mere helper or someone who crafted a useful mythology. I don't think he
Right.
would have been pleased with that.
Yeah, and of course, I would submit that that what Freud tried to do and his early followers tried to do was still legitimately operating within the realm of what would be called legitimate attempts at science of that period. But if you frame it in like you know, in sort of the context of like Popper's theories of falsification, or in terms of like modern sort of statistical reasoning and sort of that basic assumptions of certain experimental designs, you could easily see how it does, you know, that it needs to be reframed to be maximally useful, because that particular way of defining what an enterprise is scientific has sort of fallen away as something that's very generative within psychology.
Yeah, I'm going to resist the temptation to argue about correspondence and pragmatic theories of truth. And I'll go into what my concerns are for psychoanalysis and hear you out. So my concerns are, you know, there's the typical ones that psychoanalytic concepts and theories don't seem falsifiable. They're based on case studies, anecdotes. It's not clear how you would operationally define a lot of these constructs. That's the kind of typical stuff. And that was the reason why going into your class and coming out of your class, I mean, I had a more nuanced version of my negative anti-Freud sentiment after coming out of your class, but it was still negative.
Yeah.
Those were the kind of
Which I want to stipulate that having a negative perspective of some type of psychoanalysis is an extremely tenable and defensible position.
I
And it
should
would
hope so.
silly for me not to acknowledge that.
Yeah, so I had the stock reasons for not liking Freud, and I'd like to hear what I mean, you're probably well versed already and you've heard those a lot, so you could probably respond to that. But also, as I've read up to become a more authoritative history of psychology teacher, reading up a lot on Freud, I came across the work of Frederick Crews. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
No, you need to tell me a little bit about it.
Okay. He was an English professor who was big into the psychoanalytic boom in the humanities until he became disenchanted by psychoanalysis. He didn't like that his students would come up with mutually incompatible interpretations of a text, and they had no way of adjudicating who's right, which is funny because you'd think a literature professor wouldn't view it that way.
Yeah.
And so he went on a career of, joining a bunch of other people that was kind of this anti-Freud, journalistic, historical, investigative, muckraking expedition. And Crews was kind of leading it, and he's been a very vocal, and I don't know if you can call him prominent because I don't think that many people have heard of him. He catalogs some of the good points that this movement in general have come up with. For instance, well, a lot of his material comes from unredacted correspondences between Freud and his friend Wilhelm Fliess. And so we have that side of the conversation for posterity, and it's not always flattering to Freud.
No, in fact, he comes off as a big old liar in some cases.
Yeah, so you have
kind
of
I'm familiar with some of that
okay.
data and some of the really disturbing accounts of these horrible things happening, and Freud either not addressing it or avoiding,
Yeah, so kind of he's got a little bit of a dirty paper trail that has emerged. One point that group, and it's not, Crews doesn't own that whole body of muckraking, but here's just one thing that you don't even have to do much muckraking about. So when Freud and Breuer came up with seduction theory, or Crews prefers to call it molestation theory, because he says, let's call it what it is. There's no seduction.
Mm-hmm.
The case studies they talk about will say, a school teacher tried to molest my patient, a gardener tried to molest my patient, an uncle did. And that's where these repressed memories of sexual activity came from. But then later, when he developed the Oedipus complex, he said it was always the mother or the father, which doesn't make sense if before his case studies said it was various people committing these sexual acts. But then later, I mean, did he have selective amnesia? Looking back at his case, it's that. So you said you're aware that there's this kind of not so clear picture of his honesty.
Yeah, and even when it comes to what may have been some of the immediate consequences of taking that particular explanatory track, how much damage that could have done to some of those living human beings who had done, who had recounted these memories and then had them sort of the flavor of it is to have it automatically almost, or, attributed to unconscious fantasizing of, sexual encounters, which to me has a lot of disturbing overtones to that,
So I'm looking at this and I'm thinking,
it leaves a bad taste in it, and
yeah. So I mean, what do you say to someone who says, okay, you got the normal, this is not real science and this can't be empirically valid, and apparently there was fraud? I mean, what do you say in defense of psychoanalysis? Or
I wouldn't go too far deep into defending too much, because I'm disturbed by those things too. I am not actually one of the sort of broad sort of approaches that I ended up really resonating with in the training that I was given was this distinction that was drawn between what were called meta-analytic sorts of concepts and what were called clinical level theoretical concepts within psychoanalysis. And so then the closer that the concept was linked up to frequently observable processes that multiple people could report on as happening in psychotherapy, the more durable the concept is, the more approachable the concept is, and in my view, the more useful the concept. The further that concept gets away from the on the ground, repeatable, descriptions of clinical situations, not just a Brewer, case study or Freud case, but like multiple accounts. The further it gets from that, the more that it is sort of a theoretical explanation as to why these things happen. The less useful they tend to be, the less approachable the concepts tend to be, the less I'd be inclined to defend. So how far am I going to defend a concept like penis envy? Not too far. I'm not, how much would I defend the usefulness of the concept of defense mechanisms? Pretty far, in that defense mechanisms may or may not be what psychoanalysis says they are from a theoretical standpoint, but it's very hard to deny that people engage in behaviors that seem to fit the description. And in fact, the existence of something that we have labeled defense mechanisms is so plausible that B.F. Skinner devoted an entire chapter into science and human behavior to basically describing defense mechanisms from a more radical behavior analytic friendly framework. It's like what might be going on from an environment behavior relation standpoint when these things that people call defense mechanisms come up. So I don't know if that's weaselly, right? Because basically what I'm saying is I think that there are some larger propositions that are sort of the undergirding of psychoanalytic principles that to me are very broad and less controversial. And I think that that those have had an interesting and influential voice in the evolution of how we see human behavior. And it's been culturally influential in ways that in some ways I think are very important and positive. But in terms of like the nuts and bolts of his theory, as terms of like the libido and sort of psychic energy and the way, and like fantasizing or dreams as necessarily a manifestation of the conversion of psychic energy into specific kinds of imagery, and and then all of that stuff about seduction theory and all of that seems to be somebody who, like, part of the contingency, this is the behaviorist in me coming out, that part of the contingencies of that moment is that he desperately wanted to have a theory that was all encompassing as he could make it, that was going to be popular, that was going to be ambitious, and that in order to gain favor for the system, he went some directions that I think were not warranted by the data. However, I don't think that those things undermine all of the sort of larger propositions. The larger propositions being that to some degree, it's useful to think of behavior as determined. For some degree, it's useful to think of behavior as determined by factors that happened in the course of your lifetime, with a special value at times in consideration of your narrative of early developmental experiences and the important relationships that they formed. The idea that these important early relationships are part of the framework for which we end up the lens that through which we see other relationships in the future. The idea that processes that one might loosely label as irrational processes, emotions, distorted sort of views of the world play a role in the meaning of things and how we wrestle with things kind of moving forward. Those to me are very broadly stated some themes. And there are certain metaphors within psychoanalytic theory, again, that are very broad, that I don't feel like have been pointed out as toxic. So like id, ego, superego, I don't take those too literally, but I find them to be useful metaphors at times for, capturing that there are different forces or different types of processes within our mental world that are not always pulling in the same direction, and that therefore like the idea of conflict has some value to me. And I actually think that there is potential for some of those concepts to generate testable ideas or hypotheses, even though the larger theory as a whole is impervious to testing and therefore arguably as a whole not scientific, certainly not in a Popper kind of sense.
Yeah, I mean, people talk about having a lizard brain versus a mammalian brain, which is, I think, useful in the same sense that ego, superego might be useful to talk about. And likewise doesn't stand up to like modern neuroscientific understandings of how the brain actually evolved.
Sure. I mean, even left brain, right brain distinctions,
yeah,
which are very common today, are, if you push on them, don't hold up completely, at least.
not in the way that popular culture has portrayed it, for sure.
Right. Sure, for sure. So tell me your take. Did I dodge that question, or did I address it? What I feel like there's a built-in a little bit of a dodge, but I'm not intentionally trying to sort of get away from
no, I think disowning Freud the man and talking about the concepts being, I don't want to say useful fictions, because fictions might not be the right word. They're not arbitrary.
Right.
A useful terminology or a useful set of metaphors, like you said.
Yeah.
That segues into something I wanted to touch on if we had time, but it just perfectly segues into our friend Wittgenstein, who I don't know if you knew about Wittgenstein's take on Freud.
No, tell me.
Well, Wittgenstein thought that Freud is a peddler of personal mythology, and that your personal mythology has pragmatic value. And really what therapy boils down to is being a salesman, that you convince someone that some emotionally adaptive personal mythology is better. And that opens up all kinds of questions that are interesting about, like, are you in a position to know when you need your client to be in touch with reality, or when you can let them believe something, but just frame it a certain way that I'm not ready to answer? But it becomes a completely different conversation from where you started with Freud.
Yeah. When you started with the word peddler, I was thinking, oh, I might have to do some defense here. But then when you continued with it, like the whole thing, I was like, not only is that quite a defensible position on Freud, that is moving towards how some people are starting to conceptualize psychotherapy as a whole. That there are those within psychotherapy research who make the argument that what is most essential and healing about the process of psychotherapy is two individuals co-creating based upon certain principles, an agreed upon set of rules about how you're going to get better, and you engage in practices that are sort of strengthening your belief in what you're doing to move towards health. So that a big part of psychotherapy, according to this argument, is that you have to believe in what you're doing, and that you have, and to some degree, the therapist and the client end up agreeing to or helping to co-create sort of this framework of reality that is not, it's not entirely a fiction, because really, in order for that framework to hold up, it has to have some plausibility, right? It has to be anchored to some degree in what is real. But there are multiple ways of approaching the same thing, as long as there is sort of like this community of people that are operating by those rules, buying into those rules, and doing like rituals and practice and growth kinds of activities that are centered around these rules that you believe in. And psychoanalysis is one of the older perspectives that established a particular set of, rules, fiction, stories, ways of talking about things, that parts of it captured the public imagination, and parts of it capture the public imagination to this day, especially if you watch certain types of movies. Shutter Island, for example.
Oh boy. Opening up all kinds of potential conversations. But I love it because it deflates the core of psychoanalysis, but still preserves it as valuable, because it is valuable to have a good set of building blocks and tools to help clients create this plausible, functional worldview that gets them through the day.
And I also was taught, again, and forgive me for when I talk about philosophical concepts and use them incorrectly, it also brings me to what I think of as what I thought of as like a pragmatic use of the term interpretation, which gets back to what I talked about at the beginning, that an interpretation is not, the goal of interpretation, the way I was taught, was not to be right. The ultimate value of an interpretation is not whether it's correct or not, as if we could ever know if my interpretation of why you do what you do is right, but how useful it is. And usefulness would be, the metric is, how generative is that? How much conversation is that generate? How many new directions in putting things together, or remembering things, or looking at things from different angles that generates? And sometimes an interpretation that is arguably flat out wrong can still be a successful interpretation because of its generativity. And really, to me, that makes it so much more human, and less, the more that psychoanalysis is portrayed as almost like a like a version of like the mystic on the top of the mountain, truth from on high, the more it doesn't hold up for me. The more that these concepts such as the id, or concepts such as defense mechanisms, or concepts such as an interpretation, are sort of grounded in the here and now of my interaction with you, the more I'm like, not only am I finding it more tenable, the more I'm like, well, maybe I could do that. Maybe that's something that I am qualified to do, to engage in a conversation with you, where I'm guiding you, but I am not the expert of all things. I am not the mind reader that absolutely knows why you're saying what you're saying. I am somebody who is trained in engaging in thoughtful discourse, examining narratives, examining your history, examining important relationships, and directing it, in various ways.
Awesome. I can totally respect that.
Thank you. And at some point you can certainly um, correct me and educate me on a little bit more on point sort of interpretation of what correspondence theory would entail or what pragmatism means to you, you know.
Oh, well, you know, as a hard-nosed sciencey guy who positions himself as pursuing the truth that corresponds, I have carved out a place to respect a pragmatic understanding of truth, just as long as you don't call it truth, it's useful. But you know, if you're not saying it's true, and you're just clear about when you're talking about empirical truths versus things I believe that are adaptive to me, that's like as long that's a different thing that happens to share the same word, that's fine.
Yeah. Or I mean, I would like propose as another compromise that you can just make it clear you can use truth that way, but that's not how I use it, and I would never use truth in that.
Yeah.
Agree, disagree, you know, that kind of.
You know, I saw a debate where a guy said, you know, we used to say truth is beauty, and now you see something, and like you had this very muddled, illogical argument that didn't make sense, all premised on the idea that if two concepts share the same word, you must therefore be able to transfer one meaning to the other in an argument. But I'm the opposite.
Yeah.
It's like you gotta cut everything up and specify what you mean. And
Well, I think that if you don't, you end up with some unfortunate conversations that drag on until finally you realize that you were using your terms completely differently, and you have to rewrite what the last hour conversation actually meant, which it can be quite draining, you know, to do that. I do find that I would argue that I know that you had your conversation with Nolan before, that I would argue that Skinner's ideas are rooted in a version of a pragmatic vision, an application of the universe. I'll avoid the T word. But you know, that they have like that Skinner's formulations work through a pragmatic lens. So like the argument is that if your goal is to have precise influence of behavior, here is a perspective and a set of methodologies that have been shown to work a lot in a lot of different for the purposes of doing that. And that in terms of some of the deeper, larger, more encompassing questions about the universe, that the more that you push on Skinner, the more that you find that he kind of ends up being like, well, I don't know that for sure. You know, what I know is in the little part slice of the world that I'm doing, I'm arguing that this works. And so then when he rejects beyond freedom and dignity, you know, it's a title of one of his books, that I've come to hold that a little bit more loosely than before. When I first read that, I thought that he was attacking the existence of the concepts of freedom and dignity. And then later on, and maybe he was, but later on, I came to find that, at least for me, I would prefer to think that he was saying is that the language system that puts so much value and allegiance to these words of freedom and dignity needs to rethink whether or not we should be hanging our hat as on those things as the answer of all things, because the way that we use those words has led to some dead ends. And maybe there's a different way of talking about these things that's actually encompassing some of the content of what we call freedom, you know, and dignity, but it's sort of a different way of attacking it. So, and I think that at its best, psychoanalysis, the way that it's valuable to me, is pointing its way towards certainly clinical work that is focused on, you know, what is it that we want to accomplish and how can we get there? And also even scientifically thinking about, okay, what kinds of testable propositions can we come up with scientifically that are taking advantage of some of the interesting propositions that were raised by psychoanalytic theory. Things like, you know, when psychoanalysis refers to internal conflict, okay, it's like, to me, there's something interesting going on there, but you have to go through a process. Let's hash this out. what would that translate into? Because I do think that there's something there, but
Mhm.
I that it takes work to make it really, really contribute to good research ideas.
Absolutely.
One last thing that I may have mentioned this in your class, but it's this sort of parable, modern parable that I've actually heard told with different outcomes and different things. So I'm going to tell you the way I remember it, which is the story is a man comes into a darkened parking lot.
Yep.
You probably heard this, right? He runs across this guy on his hands and knees underneath a lamppost in the parking lot. And he goes, "Hi, can I help you out?" The guy goes, "I don't know. I'm looking for my keys." And he's like, "Oh, well, okay. Usually it's been my practice that if you retrace your steps, you remember where you dropped your keys. Like, where was it last time you dropped your keys?" He's like, "Oh, out there. I'm pretty sure I dropped it out there." And it's like it's like this darkened field. And it's like, well, if it's out there, then what are you doing here? And the response is, well, the light's better. I think that my choice in using that parable or that metaphor is that psychoanalysis to some degree at times draws our attention to interesting things that up till now are still to some degree in the darkened field.
Mhm.
And the challenges for scientific approaches or more clearly delineated strategies for investigating the world to figure out ways of trying to shine a little bit more light on that. But in some cases, maybe psychoanalysis offers us some things to think about, some things to consider that are in the arena of related to something valid.
So you admit they're in the dark.
Yeah, I admit.
Yeah.
Well, I would admit, for example, that certain types of concepts that especially like again, more sort of theoretical concepts,
Mhm.
like transference of what is that exactly? What's going on? And oftentimes you have this experience of, well, there's something going on with that. We're identifying, dreams. Yeah, what the heck is it? You could think of a dream as random electrical activity, and to some degree you're correct. But what is it about the meaning that people mine from dreams? What is it about the impact that, I'm not prepared to think that Freud's explanation for dreams is going to hold up in every respect, but they're sure interesting. And I certainly have reason to think that they have angles where they are relevant for understanding human psychology and human experience and meaning. But there's a hell of a lot of room for us to shine more light in that direction. And I hope that psychoanalysis can be a counterpoint to some perspectives on dreams that are, I think, swung too far in the other direction to say, oh, what BS, the idea that like you can interpret your dreams. Dreams mean nothing. They never mean anything. They are just random. I would argue that's not true. That our recounting of dreams and the way that we have a narrative about dreams are not totally random.
Yeah, I mean, even like spreading association theories of dreaming, I mean, why did your mind wander that way? It must be because you have like these two concepts are semantically associated such that one cues the memory of the other, and you can hash that out in terms of molecules. It doesn't mean it's entirely meaningless. I mean, yeah.
Right. And like to complete a little bit of a loop about the correspondence theories, my comment about Freud was not a diss of correspondence theories, but more that I don't think that Freud's ideas hold up under a correspondence theory of truth light.
Right.
The biology that undergirds a lot of the Freudian constructions is not 21st century biology or even close.
Yeah.
So it ends up holding up much better as metaphor, as narrative, as language, as verbal relations.
Yeah, that metaphor stuck with me, and I did steal it. I know you probably stole it from someone too, so I'm not throwing you
Yeah,
off, but,
absolutely.
I've stolen it before. And something I wanted to add to it, I kind of see the light as what our current scientific abilities are, and we want to stay in the light if we're charging insurance companies for our services. And we want to apply for grant funding. We want to be in the light when we do that, and we want to expand the light's reach because we all know there's stuff outside. The way I accommodate psychoanalysis a little bit, and maybe I'm just rationalizing, like I want to keep, I want to find ways to be sympathetic to it, is, when you're a therapist, you're in an impossible situation where you have this unique person in front of you with unique problems, and there has not been a epidemiologically large study specifically studying their particular
That
problem.
person, right,
Yeah.
right. No,
So you have
that's
to
true.
artistically, not scientifically, figure out what to do with them. You have to go outside the light.
Yeah, and even therapeutic perspectives that would argue that their concepts are a little bit more grounded in a late 20th century or early 21st century empirical base. Like, for example, approaches that Nolan, might, be more attracted to, that you still get to a point in your work with an individual in front of you with their own unique history that you are not able to conduct experiments to completely get to the bottom of all of the different factors that are related to why they do what they do.
Yeah.
And so there is, if that's art, then there's always going to be some art, in the actual application of this science. And that's part of like the little sweet spot that counseling and clinical psychologists hopefully are prepared to address, is that straddle between, going by instinct and the art and figuring out ways that the science is relevant, and to recognize when things are scientific and when things are more speculative.
Completely agree.
Awesome.
Well, thanks for taking your time to provide this information for my students and give us your takes. Is there anything else you wanted to add before I hit the stop recording button?
Well, I think that you know me well enough that you know that I love having these kind of conversations. And if we had enough prompts, we go on and on and on. Anybody who has stuck with us for this long, I appreciate. You must really love psychology, or are just really devoted to finishing the recording. I hope it was interesting, because I love this.
I'm glad to hear that. We'll have to do one on Skinner. I'll have to go do some reading, and then we'll come fight about Skinner.
Awesome. Awesome. I'll be ready.
Cool. I'm gonna hit the stop button.
Okay.
The end.